Welcome to New American Mythos, where old stories are kindled like firelight, and we gather round to remember the tales that shaped us. Tonight we enter the old stone streets of Boston. This is the moment before America found her voice. Before independence, before war, before flags and declarations. A time when tyranny strutted openly, and the people looked not for arms, but for a sign. Nathanael Hawthorne's The Gray Champion tells the story of that sign, of a figure who appears not to argue or to rule, but simply to stand. In a season of stories where men disappear, where they sleep too long or vanish into myth, this tale gives us something else. A man who steps forward, a conscience incarnate, a reminder that in times of crisis, what a people needs most is not always a sword, but a witness. As you listen, watch for the moment when stillness becomes power, when the simple act of standing changes everything. This isn't just a story about rebellion, it's a story about remembrance, about presence, and about the quiet strength that precedes great change. To understand this tale, we must step back into the late 1600s, when England's colonial rule over Massachusetts was growing tense. The story is set during the reign of James II, a Catholic monarch viewed with deep suspicion by the Protestant colonists. His appointed governor, Edmund Andros, arrived in New England with armed troops, dissolved local assemblies, and attempted to revoke long-standing charters. It was a time of unease and looming confrontation, when many feared that their religious and civil liberties were slipping away. Into this atmosphere of dread, Hawthorne casts a mysterious figure, an old man who appears just as the people's courage begins to fail. He stands as a symbol, not of rebellion through violence, but of enduring covenant, memory, and divine justice. At the end of the story, we'll pause for a moment to take stock of what we have heard, not just in this story, but in the season so far. I hope you'll listen the whole way through as we explain what these myths are doing and how they remind us of who we are. The Gray Champion by Nathanael Hawthorne. There was once a time when New England groaned under the real burden of heavier wrongs than those merely threatened ones that later brought on the Revolution. James II, the bigoted successor of Charles the Voluptuous, had annulled the charters of all the colonies and sent a harsh and unprincipled soldier to take away our liberties and endanger our religion. The administration of Sir Edmund Andros lacked scarcely a single mark of tyranny. A governor and council holding office from the king and wholly independent of the country, laws made and taxes levied without the people's consent, either directly or through their representatives, the rights of private citizens violated, and the titles to all land declared void, complaints silenced by restrictions on the press, and finally, discontent subdued by the first band of mercenary troops ever to march on our free soil. For 2 years, our ancestors remained in sullen submission out of that filial love which had always secured their allegiance to the mother country, whether its ruler happened to be a parliament, a protector, or a popish monarch. Until these evil times, however, that allegiance had been largely nominal, and the colonists had ruled themselves, enjoying far more freedom than is even now the privilege of native-born subjects of Great Britain. At last, a rumor reached our shores. The Prince of Orange had ventured upon an enterprise whose success would mean the triumph of civil and religious rights and the salvation of New England. It was only a faint whisper, it might be false, or the attempt might fail, and in either case, anyone who opposed King James would lose his head. Still, the news made a marked impression. People smiled mysteriously in the streets and cast bold glances at their oppressors. Far and wide there spread a subdued and silent unrest, as if the slightest signal would awaken the whole land from its sluggish despair. Aware of their danger, the rulers resolved to avert it by an impressive display of strength, and perhaps to confirm their despotism by even harsher measures. So, one afternoon in April of 1689, Sir Edmund Andros and his favored counselors, warmed with wine, assembled the redcoats of the governor's guard and made their appearance in the streets of Boston. The sun was near setting when the march began. At that uneasy time, the roll of the drum seemed to echo through the streets, not so much as the martial music of the soldiers, but as a call to arms for the townspeople themselves. A crowd gathered by various streets into King Street, which would, nearly a century later, be the scene of another clash between British troops and a people fighting against tyranny. Though more than 60 years had passed since the Pilgrims first arrived, this crowd of their descendants still bore the strong and somber features of their character. Perhaps more strikingly so in such a grim crisis than in happier moments. There were the sober clothing, the general severity of expression, the gloomy but unshaken faces, the scriptural way of speaking, and the confidence in heaven's blessing on a just cause, all of which might have marked a band of original Puritans when facing some danger in the wilderness. Indeed, the old spirit had not yet died out. Some of the men in the street that day had worshipped beneath the trees before any house had been built for the God for whom they had gone into exile. Old soldiers of the Parliament were there too, grimly smiling at the thought that their aged arms might yet strike another blow against the House of Stuart. Also present were veterans of King Philip's War, who had burned villages and killed young and old with pious ferocity, while devout souls throughout the land supported them with prayer. Several ministers moved among the crowd which, unlike most mobs, regarded them with such reverence that it seemed their very garments were holy. These clergymen, or pastors, used their influence to calm the people, but not to scatter them. Meanwhile, the governor's decision to disturb the peace at a moment when the slightest commotion could ignite rebellion became the chief topic of conversation and was widely debated. "Satan will strike his master stroke soon," cried some, "for he knows his time is short. All our godly pastors are to be dragged to prison. We'll see them at a Smithfield fire in King Street." That is, at an execution. At this, the people of each parish pressed more closely around their ministers, who looked calmly heavenward and assumed a more apostolic dignity, fitting for men who might soon wear the crown of martyrdom. It was actually believed at the time that New England might have a John Rogers of her own to succeed the martyr in the primer. "The Pope of Rome has ordered a new St. Bartholomew's Day massacre," cried others. "We are all to be slaughtered, man and male child." Even this rumor was not entirely disbelieved, though the wiser class thought the governor's intent was likely somewhat less monstrous. His predecessor under the old charter, Bradstreet, a venerable companion of the first settlers, was known to be in town. There was reason to think that Sir Edmund Andros planned to strike fear with a military parade and to weaken the opposition by arresting their leader. "Stand firm for the old charter governor," shouted the crowd, seizing upon the idea, "the good old Governor Bradstreet." Just then, to their surprise, the well-known figure of Governor Simon Bradstreet himself appeared, a patriarch of nearly 90 years old, standing on the raised steps of a doorway. With characteristic gentleness, he urged the people to submit to the lawful authorities. "My children," the venerable man concluded, "do nothing rashly. Do not shout, but pray for New England's welfare, and wait patiently for what the Lord will do in this matter." The outcome would soon be revealed. All this while the drumbeat had been drawing closer to the cornhill, louder and deeper, until it echoed from house to house. Then, the steady tramp of marching feet, it burst into the street. A double line of soldiers appeared, filling the whole width of the passage. Their matchlocks, which are rifles, rested on their shoulders, and the burning match cords created a line of tiny fires in the gathering dusk. Their steady advance resembled the motion of some great machine that would roll over anything in its path. Following slowly, with the clatter of hooves on the pavement, came a group of mounted gentlemen. At the center rode Sir Edmund Andros himself, an older man, but upright and soldierly. Beside him were his favored counselors, the bitterest enemies of all New England. At his right rode Edward Randolph, our arch-enemy, that blasted wretch, as Cotton Mather had called him, who had brought down our ancient government and was followed through life and to his grave by a palpable curse. On his other side stood Bullivant, tossing out jests and mockery as he passed. Behind them came Dudley, eyes downcast, dreading, as he rightly should, the indignant looks of the people, who saw in him the only native-born New Englander among their oppressors. A navy captain from the harbor and 2 or 3 crown-appointed civil officers also rode with them. But the figure that drew the most attention and stirred the deepest feeling was the Episcopal clergyman from King's Chapel, riding proudly among the magistrates in his priestly vestments, the very image of prelacy and persecution, of the union of church and state, and of all those abominations that had driven the Puritans into the wilderness. Another double rank of soldiers brought up the rear. The entire scene was a picture of New England's condition, and its moral, the deformity of any government that does not grow organically from the nature of things and the character of the people. On one side stood the religious multitude, with their sorrowful faces and dark clothing. On the other, the group of despotic rulers, with the high churchman at their center, and here and there a crucifix upon their bosoms, all richly dressed, flushed with wine, proud of unjust authority, and mocking the universal groan of the people. The mercenary soldiers, waiting only for the command to drench the street with blood, revealed the sole means by which obedience could be enforced. "O Lord of hosts," cried a voice from the crowd, "provide a champion for thy people." This outcry was loudly spoken and served as a herald's call, announcing the arrival of a remarkable figure. The crowd had drawn back and now clustered near the end of the street, while the soldiers had advanced only a third of its length. The space between was empty, a paved solitude between tall buildings that cast deep shadows, like twilight across the way. Suddenly, an ancient man appeared, as if he had emerged from the crowd and began walking alone down the middle of the street to confront the armed troops. He wore the old Puritan dress, a dark cloak, and a steeple-crowned hat in the style of at least 50 years earlier, with a heavy sword at his thigh, but a staff in his hand to aid the trembling steps of age. When he was some distance from the multitude, the man slowly turned, revealing a face of antique majesty, made all the more venerable by a white beard that flowed down his chest. He made a gesture that was both an encouragement and a warning, then turned again and continued his path. "Who is this gray patriarch?" asked the young men of their fathers. "Who is this venerable brother?" asked the old men of themselves. But none could answer. The patriarchs of the people, men of 80 and older, were troubled, wondering how they could forget someone of such evident authority, who must have been known to them in their youth. A companion of John Winthrop and the old counselors, making laws, offering prayers, and leading them in battle against the savages. The middle-aged men should have remembered him too, his locks already gray when they were young, as their own were now. And the youth, how could they have entirely forgotten that hoary elder? Hoary means white-haired. A remnant of a vanished age whose solemn blessing must once have rested on their bare heads in childhood. "Where did he come from? What is his purpose? How can this old man be?" the crowd whispered in wonder. Meanwhile, the venerable stranger, leaning on his staff, continued his solitary walk down the center of the street. As he neared the advancing soldiers, and as the drumbeat struck full upon his ears, the old man straightened into a loftier position. the fragility of age seemed to fall from him, leaving behind a figure of unbroken dignity. He now marched forward with a warrior's stride, keeping time with the military rhythm. So the aged form moved on one side, and the full parade of soldiers and magistrates on the other, until, when scarcely 20 yards remained between them, the old man grasped his staff at its center and held it before him like a commander's baton. "Stand!" he cried. His eye, his face, his commanding posture, the solemn yet warlike ring of that voice, fit either to lead an army or rise to heaven in prayer, were irresistible. At the old man's word and uplifted arm, the drum fell silent at once, and the advancing line came to a halt. A trembling awe seized the crowd. That stately form, combining the leader and the saint, so gray, so dimly seen, dressed in such ancient garb, could only be the risen spirit of some old champion of righteousness, summoned from the grave by the oppressor's drum. They raised a shout of reverence and hope and looked for New England's deliverance. The governor and his gentlemen, seeing themselves brought to an unexpected halt, spurred forward, as if they meant to ride their nervous and rearing horses directly at the hoary figure. Yet he did not flinch. His stern gaze swept across the surrounding group and finally settled, cold and fixed, on Sir Edmund Andros. It seemed as though the grim old man were the true ruler there, and that the governor, his council, and the soldiers backing him, representing all the power of the crown of England, had no choice but to obey. "What does this old fellow want here?" Edward Randolph cried out harshly. "On, Sir Edmund! Order the soldiers forward, and give this old dotard the same choice you gave all his countrymen. Step aside, or be trampled." "Nay, nay, let us show some respect at the good grandsire," said Bullivant with a laugh. "See you not? He's some old roundhead dignitary, who has been asleep these 30 years, and knows nothing of how times have changed. Doubtless he thinks he can stop us with a proclamation in old Noll's name." "Are you mad, old man?" shouted Sir Edmund Andros, harsh and loud. "How dare you obstruct the march of King James' governor?" "I have stayed the march of a king himself before now," replied the gray figure with stern composure. "I am here, Sir Governor, because the cry of an oppressed people has disturbed me in my hidden place, and, asking this favor earnestly of the Lord, it was granted me to appear once more on earth in the good old cause of his saints. And why do you talk of James? There is no longer a popish tyrant on England's throne. By noon tomorrow, his name shall be a byword in this very street, where today you would make it a name of terror. Back, you who once were governor, back! With this night your power ends. Tomorrow, the prison. Back, unless you would have me prophesy the scaffold." The people had drawn in closer and hung on every word of their champion, who spoke in tones long unused, like a man accustomed to converse only with the dead of many years past. But his voice stirred their very souls. They faced the soldiers, not without weapons of their own, and were ready to turn the street's very stones into tools of battle. Sir Edmund Andros looked at the old man. Then he cast his cold and cruel eyes over the crowd, seeing them ablaze with that fierce wrath that is so hard to ignite and harder still to quench. Then once more he looked to the aged figure, who stood in an open space where neither friend nor foe had dared to intrude. Let's pause for a moment here. In this tale, there is no miracle, only a moment. But in that moment, the whole moral structure of a people shifts. The old man does not fight, and he does not run. He simply stands. He becomes, in his stillness, the answer to every doubt that haunts the oppressed. Will someone rise? Will truth speak? Is God still with us? This great champion does not argue for rights. He reminds the people that they already possess them. And this is the pivot point of the American myth, not from weakness to war, but from fear to clarity. The idea that justice is not always about action first, but about presence. A righteous stillness that unmasks corruption simply by refusing to bow. Let's get back into the story. What thoughts passed through the governor's mind, he revealed in no word. But whether he was cowed by the gray champion's look, which means scared, or sensed the peril in the crowd's rising fury, it is certain that he gave the order to retreat. The soldiers slowly and cautiously fell back. Before the next sunset, the governor and all who had so proudly ridden with him were indeed prisoners. And long before the news arrived that King James had abdicated the throne, King William was indeed proclaimed throughout New England. But where was the Grey Champion? Some reported that when the troops had departed from King Street, and the people were thronging tumultuously in their rear, Bradstreet, the aged governor, was seen to embrace a form more aged even than his own. Others soberly affirmed that, even as they marveled at the venerable grandeur of his aspect, the old men had faded from their eyes, melting slowly into the hues of twilight, until, where he had stood, there remained but an empty space. Yet all agreed that the hoary shape was gone. The men of that generation watched for his reappearance in sunshine and in shadow, but never beheld him more, nor knew when his funeral passed, nor where his gravestone might be found. And who was the Grey Champion? Perhaps his name may be traced in the records of the stern Court of Justice, which passed a sentence too mighty for its own age, yet glorious in all aftertimes, for the lesson it gave to monarchs and the high example it held forth to subjects. I have heard that when the descendants of the Puritans are called to manifest the spirit of their sires, this old man rises again. When 80 years had passed from them, he walked once more in King Street. 5 years even later, in the gray dawn of an April morning, he stood on the green beside the meeting house at Lexington, where now the obelisk of granite, with its inlaid slab of slate, commemorates the first fallen heroes of the Revolution. And when our fathers toiled through the night at the breastwork on Bunker's Hill, that is to build up the fortifications, the old warrior walked his rounds again. Long, long may it be, here he comes again. His hour is one of darkness and adversity and peril. But should domestic tyranny oppress us, or the invader's foot pollute our soil, still may the Grey Champion appear, for he is the type of New England's hereditary spirit, and his shadowy march on the eve of danger must ever be the pledge that New England's sons will vindicate their heritage. And so the story ends. The Grey Champion vanishes as silently as he came. There is no celebration, no parade, only the turning of a tide. And this is how Hawthorne ends his story, with the people changed, the oppressor gone, and the witness to truth and covenant already a memory. It's a quiet triumph, not of might, but of moral resolve. In the streets of early Boston, before revolution had a name, the people did not rise because they were told to. They rose because something old and righteous stood among them. And when it had done its work, it returned to the silence. Not all legends must last forever. Some are meant to appear only once, and leave us watching the road, waiting should we ever need them again. We're at the halfway point of the season. As a reminder, our Patreon members will actually get access to 2 additional bonus episodes at the end of the season, but for all intents and purposes, this is the halfway point. I'd like to take a moment to reflect on some of the stories and themes that have emerged so far. We've come halfway through the Hollow, 3 stories told, 3 shadows cast. We've met a man who slept through time, a schoolmaster who vanished into legend, and now an old warrior who rose for a moment and then was gone. Each of them, Rip Van Winkle, Ichabod Crane, and the Grey Champion, reveals a different part of the American soul. One forgets, one flees, and one stands. One drifts into silence, one into myth, and one into memory. These men are not merely characters, they are conditions. Conditions of conscience, of culture, and of faith. Rip Van Winkle sleeps while the world moves, and when he wakes, the war is over, the country has changed. He did not necessarily sin, but neither did he stand. His myth is a caution to those who drift. Ichabod Crane sings and flatters, consumes and fears. He walks with dreams, but lacks ballast. He is devoured not by evil, but by emptiness, and we do not know what becomes of him. His name is lost in laughter and in ghost stories. And the Grey Champion? He arrives only in the hour of greatest need. He does not build, fight, or remain, but he stands, he confronts, and in doing so, he reveals the falsehood of the mighty. In American myths, judgment rarely comes with armies. Instead, it comes in the form of memory, of presence, of a figure who reminds more than he rules. Perhaps every people waits for such a figure, not to govern, but to witness, to say without speaking, judgment walks among us. That may be a foreign idea to us now. A witness is not merely someone who sees, but someone who reveals what cannot be denied. In Scripture, witnesses confirm the truth, not by persuasion, but simply by bearing it. They are the ones who stand when others kneel, who hold ground so others know where it lies, and because they appear, others can build. And this is where something subtle enters our imagination, because witnesses do not only halt oppression, they awaken the builders, those who carry the quiet burden of starting again. In this mythos, standing must come before sending. The conscience must rise before the hand can build. Without a moral witness, expansion becomes conquest. But when we heed the witness, it becomes a calling. And so this first half of our season is a meditation on moral posture and position, on how a nation waits for clarity, not necessarily of law, but of soul, and how stories, more than laws, form the spine of a culture. But what happens when no gray figure appears, when silence lingers, and no one rises? Because the stories ahead grow darker, more spectral, more moral. In the coming weeks, we will meet men who bargain, who hunger, and who hide. The devil waits in the woods, a Wendigo wails in the north, and in quiet parsonages, secrets stir. Stay with us. The Hollow still has echoes to give. Join us next week for The Devil and Tom Walker. Thank you for listening to New American Mythos. If these stories have stirred something in you, one of the best ways to support the show is by joining our community on Patreon. At the first donation tier, you'll receive early access to all episodes, plus 2 exclusive bonus episodes when the season concludes. At the next level, you'll receive a special gift in December, a free copy of this season's separate audiobook project, our modernized recording of Washington Irving's novel, Old Christmas. And for our top-tier patrons, You'll receive a signed, limited, and early edition copy of the bound collection of this season's myths, a tangible piece of the world we're building together. Your support keeps the lantern lit and ensures these old stories can speak anew. Thank you for walking this road with us.